Hi everybody and welcome to the Deep Dive, where I go into as much depth into one particular subject that I can in a 10-minute video, covering some of the basic aspects and features to consider when you're looking at to invest in a rebreather. And when I say invest, a rebreather is a real investment because they're not as simple as a set of regulators, they're a touch more expensive as well. So if you've heard of rebreathers and don't really know much about them and want to know more, or you're just thinking about trying the silent world of rebreathers, then hopefully this video might help you out a little bit. Now there are a ton of clever rebreather designs out there, but I'm only going to break down the real basics, most standard features, because there were just so many independent designs with very clever little twists on the concepts, but hopefully after this you'll better understand some of the main parts of a rebreather and what makes those clever little twists so darn clever, so that when you consider which rebreather might be the one for you, you're a bit more enlightened. So the first thing that you'll notice when you start looking at rebreathers in general is that they come in two basic styles, either semi-closed and closed. You'll often see the rebreather unit described as either SCR or CCR. Semi-closed rebreather or closed circuit rebreather, and there are a few fundamental differences. So a semi-closed rebreather will usually only have one single small cylinder of nitrox that feeds the loop with both gas volume and oxygen-rich gas. If the rebreather needs to top up the oxygen because you've been breathing it, then it has to add a certain amount of volume, gas volume, to the loop, and when that volume gets too high, a valve in the rebreather will vent the excess volume. So the loop is closed until the volume gets a little bit too high and then it vents, so it's semi-closed. Closed circuit rebreathers usually have two separate small tanks, one with pure oxygen and another one with air or diluent. So the diluent cylinder is usually filled with air, and it's there for volume, to keep the loop at a constant volume of breathable gas and to dilute the O2 if that gets too high. And the pure oxygen is there to just adjust the oxygen concentration without adding too much volume to the loop. Because a closed circuit rebreather, a CCR, doesn't add very much volume when it tops up the O2, it doesn't need to vent very much, if any, gas volume, so there won't be an automated sort of vent, so that's why it's a closed loop. But you can always break the loop by exhaling through your nose if you need to adjust your buoyancy. Inside the complicated unit will be an array of gas sensors that analyze your gas mix as it passes through. You often have multiple oxygen sensors for a bit of redundancy, and in some instances you may also find a CO2, a carbon dioxide sensor, or at least the option to fit a CO2 sensor at least, because it's not an essential sensor in a lot of units. As you breathe the loop and the gas is circulated around, the oxygen is naturally going to drop as your body absorbs it and just metabolizes it, so the gas will pass over usually 3 oxygen sensors to analyze the amount of oxygen in that loop as it circles around, and then either top it up with a solenoid or something, or it'll tell you to do it manually by pressing on a button. Why 3? Well, the chances of one oxygen sensor failing on a dive are fairly low, but never 0. The chances of 2 failing at the same time on one dive, again, are very low, but again, never 0, so 3 is just good redundancy. Some rebreathers will give you the option of fitting a carbon dioxide sensor to the array of sensors, and this is to alert you of rising CO2 levels in the loop if there is a problem with your scrubber. Now, I'm going to talk about your scrubber in the next in a little bit more detail, but you basically want to keep the CO2 level in your loop as low as possible, and if your scrubber isn't packed correctly, then it may find an easy track through the scrubber and the CO2 level can quietly increase. If you do have a CO2 sensor fitted, then it will alert you, but they're not essential, and many rebreathers don't even have a port for them. You just need to make sure that you pack your scrubber correctly. Yeah, so your scrubber will often be one of the largest sections of your rebreather and will have a canister of granules that your exhaled gas passes through, and those granules, they're going to be absorbing as much of the carbon dioxide that you're breathing out as possible. Most scrubber canisters are just a cylinder that you pack yourself with those granules. You buy the granules in a large tub and then decant what you need from that. Some do offer pre-packed canisters, but they're not that common or cost effective really, so a lot of people just pack their own scrubber. Some rebreather designs have multiple sections for scrubber instead of one big single section to reduce the bulky volume of the scrubber and also to increase the path that the gas needs to pass through. The whole point is to really scrub all of that carbon dioxide out of the gas as possible. So you'll find radial designs and other clever mechanisms, so do take a look at the scrubber design on the different units because they are quite interesting. Rebreathers will have counter lungs built into them somewhere that mirror the volume of your lungs, and they're either fitted over your shoulders or in front of you or somewhere on your back. You tend to have two counter lungs. It depends on the unit, but typically there's two, and they're basically plastic bags, but they do have a few beneficial functions. One is to catch water and spit so that it doesn't get into the scrubber, but they mainly act as a reservoir to hold the gas in the loop when you're fully exhaled, which is great because your buoyancy never changes like on open circuit. If you exhale, you don't start to sink down because your overall volume hasn't changed. Where the counter lungs are, they do make a bit of difference, is really in your buoyancy, and that is one of the huge benefits of rebreathers because your buoyancy is set. Now, because there's no pressure to the gas that you're breathing around in the loop, it just circulates through one-way valves and just your diaphragm and your lungs just naturally pushing and pulling the gas around that loop. But because the loop isn't pressurized like open circuit, the gas in the loop naturally always wants to go to the highest point in the water. So if your counter lungs are low on your chest and you're flat in the water, it's really easy to inhale, because when you're horizontal in the water, the gas wants to go up into your lungs, but it can be harder to exhale because you have to push the gas downwards in the water column. The opposite is with back-mounted counter lungs. It's a bit easier to inhale because you have to pull the gas downwards a little bit. Exhaling is much easier because it naturally wants to go up. That's why you tend to find shoulder-mounted counter lungs, because they can sit kind of in the middle when you're horizontal, kind of level with your actual lungs. So they're the best all-rounder. Rebreathers will have a slightly different mouthpiece design to a traditional regulator second stage. So rebreathers will have a double hose design, one in hose and one out hose, so that the mouthpiece will sit in the middle of those two corrugated hoses, but there are a few design options just in that mouthpiece. The most basic is just a mouthpiece, but this opens up the risk of letting water into the loop, which is a huge no-no. So they often have some kind of shut-off valve so that you can close that mouthpiece and stop water from getting into the loop whenever that mouthpiece is out of your mouth. These are often called DSVs or dive surface valves. So if you ever need to take that mouthpiece out, switch that, and that stops water getting into the loop. For extra redundancy, some mouthpieces have a second stage actually built into them, so you'll have the same kind of switch from breathing the loop to closing the loop, and now you're going to be breathing from the diluent or the nitrox tank. These are usually called BOVs or bailout valves, so if there's a problem, you can flick the switch and you're immediately breathing from a traditional second stage without the need to physically switch to a separate bailout tank. They're also easier to clear when you go to put them back in the water, because that mouthpiece, like a normal second stage, is going to be full of water, but instead of having to blow that water out, you have a purge button like a traditional second stage. You'll probably see some rebreathers advertised as manual or automatic, or called something like an ECCR or something, and this usually refers to how and when gas is added to the loop. Rebreathers can be purely manual, where you are in full control of when O2 and diluent is added to the loop by activating separate valves for each of those. You check your computer, you check the O2 partial pressure, and you top it up as needed, and then you top up the loop with volume with diluent as and when you need it by pressing on separate buttons. And that's quite labor intensive, so a lot of rebreathers nowadays will be electronically controlled. You set the desired PPO2 and the computer basically does the rest using clever solenoids. For diluents, you often have an ADV, which is an automatic diluent valve that tops up the gas volume if it feels that you continue to inhale and there isn't enough volume in the loop. It just adds a little bit. So if you're sucking and it feels like it's running on empty, the ADV will let a little bit more gas into the loop. But if you don't trust electronics submerged underwater, then you can always have the manual valves working parallel, and you can always override the electronic automatic ones. One of the newest twists to both open circuit and rebreathers in recent years is side mount. So you can now find rebreathers the shape and size of a traditional cylinder that are self-contained rebreathers, and you can mount them on one side. The twin corrugated hoses, they come up together with a normal mouthpiece, and you get the flexibility of side mount with the benefits of a rebreather as well. So they are a clever addition to our repertoire. Rebreathers will usually have their own integrated dive computer on a cable. A lot of the time it can just be a simple display that connects to all of the sensors, and some rebreathers will allow for a connection to another dive computer with all the bells and whistles. Something like a Fisher cable will connect them. Otherwise, you can use an independent computer, but it will need to be set to a fixed set point, so you need to make sure your computer has that feature fitted in it, or you just switch it to basic gauge mode, but then it just acts as a depth gauge and bottom timer, so it won't be particularly accurate because it doesn't know exactly the gas mix that you're breathing from at each specific time. So it is nice if you can fully integrate a dive computer using a Fisher cable or something similar. So that was a really quick breakdown of most of the key features on a rebreather. For each of those, I could probably do an entire video on each individual feature and then break it down from there. But the best thing that you can do is just take some time now and look at each model that's on the market, and just take note of each of its features, and then find yourself a good instructor and discuss those separate models that you're interested in regards to your needs and your kind of diving, so that you can make a more informed decision. Try and ask around on scuba diving forums what units other divers dive and why, because there's just a whole bunch of different units out there. And even when you've chosen a specific unit, you can then build them in slightly different ways and upgrade them in certain ways. So if this is your first foray into the silent world of rebreathers, then you have a lot more work to do, I'm afraid. A lot of research goes into finding exactly the right one that works for you. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe, do all those social media things that really do help our channel grow, and head over to simplyscuba.com to check out the latest and greatest scuba diving equipment out there. Thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving.